Rousseau, and good morning. Today we'll be discussing how leaders create psychological safety in the workplace, an environment in which employees feel confident in asking questions, offering ideas, challenging your decisions, and admitting their own mistakes without the organisation spiralling toward rebellion and chaos. Please use the chat function if you have any comments or observations, and questions should be put into the Q&A. Now we'll try and answer them either during the session or after the discussion this morning. In a moment, I'll give a brief introduction to psychological safety, but first let me introduce myself and the panel. Next slide, please. So I'm James Whitehead. I'm a former British Army officer, business consultant, and now a senior lecturer in strategic management at Cardiff Metropolitan University. I've been fascinated by leaders and leadership for as long as I can remember, and now I have the pleasure of reading, writing, and talking about them for a living. Some of you may have attended the last panel I chaired for Chambers Wales on network leadership, and my book on that subject is finally available at the end of this month. Please forgive the blatant product placement, but my summer holiday rests on the proceeds. So, joining me this morning to talk about leadership, I'm delighted to welcome a very experienced and diverse panel who in many ways exemplify the power of networks. First of all, Ray Davies, Managing Director of the Digital Manufacturing Innovation Hub Wales, a non-profit technology support service for the manufacturing and process industries. Ray is a business development specialist with over 20 years experience in helping SMEs to innovate, invigorate, digitise and internationalise their business operations. Formerly engaged in local government and local authority regeneration programmes for industry and technology, Ray is ideally placed to support innovation in industry through collaborative technology projects, supply chain development, and the exploitation of digital services. Jessica Lee-Jones is co-founder and chief executive of career tech startup Iongo Solutions, which was created in response to the future skills requirements of emerging and evolving industries in Wales, and aims to form the connective tissue between policymakers, training providers, and employers, collaborating to develop an effective, adaptable, and sustainable workforce for Wales. Jessica is a multi-award-winning engineer and astrophysicist, so it really is rocket science. She was 2017's Woman of the Future for Technology and Digital, appeared as one of the youngest in the Forbes 30 Under 30 Europe list of 2018, and has been recognised as an influential figure in British Lift by Who's Who 2020. Adam Keane is the Managing Director of leading bus operator Adventure Travel, which operates 150 buses and coaches across Wales and employs in excess of 320 people, including drivers, cleaners, engineers, managers, administrators, heads of department and accountants. Since his time at Adventure Travel, Adam has been working hard to attract as many applicants as possible from various different minority groups. And notably, a significant amount of work is being undertaken at the moment to attract not only LGBTQIA applicants, but also to help the wider workforce understand why it is important to have a diverse and multicultural workforce. Louise Harris is the co-founder and director of Transhead Tech, a network of spaces and online collaborations which brings together startups, scaling companies, primes and public sector organisations to innovate. Their focus is on creating opportunities and connecting entrepreneurs to the support and funding they need to grow. She's been a part of the BBC and Microsoft Microbit Invention Panel, an international trade advisor, and a member of the UK Tech Cluster Group, among an array of other exciting projects and ventures. Now, let me provide a very short introduction to psychological safety. Next slide, please. So I'll begin with a quote. Leadership is like gardening because gardeners can't do anything. They can't make plants grow or flowers bloom. They can only create the conditions in which everything flourishes and achieves its best. The words are taken from Team of Teams, a book written by former US General Stanley McChrystal, who commanded Joint Special Operations in Iraq and the International Security Assistance Force in Afghanistan. He was known as the warrior monk. He ate one vegan meal a day and ran 6 miles first thing every morning. He probably still does. So not necessarily someone you would associate with the softer skills of leadership, but he believed in them very strongly. And it's a sentiment widely shared throughout NATO military forces. It's the leader's responsibility to create the right conditions for their followers to develop as individuals and be the most productive team that they can be. And one of those conditions is psychological safety. In other words, encouraging questions, challenge, and honesty from those you lead, striking a balance between rebellion and unthinking obedience. But there's a big difference between saying you want people to speak up and actually letting them. So I'll let you read the cartoon. Now, Dilbert's humour speaks to many of us. Nobody likes to look stupid or incompetent in front of their colleagues, and certainly not in front of their boss. It is, in fact, a very deep-seated anxiety. Unfortunately, in highly uncertain and unpredictable environments, we need people to speak up and ask questions, even if someone else might think them stupid. So we need to prepare ourselves and our people in order to deal with this. In other words, how can we create a psychologically safe environment? This is important because psychological safety, the belief that we can speak up without risk of punishment or humiliation, is a well-established driver of high-quality decision-making, healthy group dynamics, individual and collective development, greater innovation, and more effective execution in organisations. Amy Edmondson, Professor of Leadership at Harvard Business School, is the one who coined the term psychological safety back in the 1990s. And she argues in her book, The Fearless Organisation, that a culture of silence can be a byproduct of an environment in which team leaders only welcome good news, and as a result, dismiss warnings and rush into poor decisions. Now, the risk of massively oversimplifying her work, I offer 3 ideas to facilitate psychological safety. Next slide, please. The first one is be humble and lead through questions. Words are cheap, but when it comes to psychological safety, there are far too many stories of managers who demand candour from their employees, particularly around mistakes, without actually demonstrating it themselves, and or without protecting others when they do share. Leaders need to own up to their own ignorance and admit mistakes in order for their teams to feel safe enough to do the same themselves. Part of this is modelling the behaviour, but equally important is being genuinely curious. So instead of making statements, try asking questions. By asking questions, you invite people to speak, and you're also modelling fallibility because you're saying, I don't know. And I want to know what you think. Next slide, please. The second point is to explain why it's important, the purpose, if you like. This is about getting people on the same page. It's about calling attention to the challenge that lies ahead, a challenge that, if it involves uncertainty, will demand that all ideas are welcome, or a project that really matters to your customers. So you must depend on each other to get it right. A clear purpose can be inspiring, but putting meaning around your work also clarifies why other people's voices matter, why you need their opinion. Next slide, please. And don't shoot the messenger. The final step is to be aware how you respond when people come to you with a mistake. Do you respond with annoyance, disappointment, or frustration? Or do you treat mistakes as a necessary part of the journey toward innovation and improvement? Managers must fight the instinct to say, how the hell did this happen? Or words to that effect. This doesn't mean you shouldn't try to get to the root cause of a mistake, but it shouldn't be your first response and it shouldn't be accusatory. Your initial reaction really matters because it sets the tone for what comes next, diagnosing the problem and finding a solution, which will require people to continue speaking up. Now, these 3 points are time-honoured wisdom, but things have changed over the last couple of years. Next slide, please. Edmondson's work has become particularly popular with the advent of COVID-19 and subsequently with the move to hybrid working. Again, hugely paraphrased, here are some of her thoughts mingled with my own. When it comes to psychological safety, managers have traditionally focused on enabling candour and dissent with respect to work content. The problem is, as the boundary between work and life has become increasingly blurred, managers have had to make staffing, scheduling and coordination decisions that increasingly impact employees' personal circumstances. And this is new territory for many. For one employee, the decision when to work from home may be driven by the need to spend time with a widowed parent or to help a child struggling at school. For another, it may be influenced by undisclosed health issues. Conversely, other employees may feel excluded from the dialogue around work-life balance because they're single or have no children. Without doubt, hybrid working arrangements present an increase in managerial complexity. Managers face the same workflow coordination challenges they've had in the past, with the added challenge of coordinating among people who can't be counted on to be present at predictable times. Furthermore, psychologically safe discussions around work-life balance are challenging because they're more likely to touch on deep-seated aspects of employees' identity, values, and choices. This makes them both more personal and riskier from an ethical and legal standpoint. At the same time, employees must understand that getting the work done for customers, for the business, for their careers, matters just as much as it always has, but it won't be done exactly as it was in the past. And both you and they will need to play a responsible and at times creative role in that. But don't expect employees to share their most personal and risky challenges right away. It takes time to build trust of this nature. Even if you've had a healthy culture of psychological safety before, again, you need to role model it. Start by making small disclosures yourself, and then make sure that you welcome others' disclosures to help your employees build confidence that sharing will not be penalised. Finally, just as with any change, look for and share the quick wins. You shouldn't share information that was disclosed to you privately, but rather explain that disclosure has allowed you to collaboratively come up with solutions that are better, not just for the organisation and the team, but also for the individuals involved. But this needs to be done with tact and skill to avoid creating pressure to conform. The goal is to provide employees with the evidence they need to buy in voluntarily to an altered model of working. Okay, so that's the theory. What about the reality? So let me turn then to the panel. And I'd like to pose the first question to the panel. And Ray, if you wouldn't mind. The question is humility and sharing. Okay, we know they're important to psychological safety, but what's your experience of being humble? I mean, does it come naturally to you, or is it something you've had to work at?
Good morning. I don't think anyone could describe me as humble. I'm going to be totally honest with you. But I hope that they would describe me as encouraging and empowering where possible and respectful of other people's opinions. I am happy to admit when I'm wrong or I don't know how to proceed with something, but obviously you draw on your leadership style through experiences that you've had, you know, as an employee, and I've had a range of some very good and some very, very bad examples that have helped me to shape my own style. Some that I can recall where I've been terrified to speak up for being ridiculed. and somewhere I've really felt that my opinion was very valued, and what I had to contribute was of the utmost importance. But the ones that stood out to me as the most effective as leaders in my eyes weren't necessarily what I would describe as humble either. But they were very good at asking other people what they thought and how they felt, good at working out a dialogue between a diverse group of people, understanding of people's points of view, opinions, cultural decisions, and other reasons that might affect a decision that they wanted to make. And keen to work out a sort of a better way as a group, no ego attached to it. It wasn't necessarily about their own force of opinion or their own sort of feeling of need to sort of impress their own sort of opinion on the situation. It was always much more for the greater good, and therefore you could understand the bigger picture. So I've tried to model myself and my style very much on that, and try to sort of take that into account when I'm dealing with and sort of taking on board other people's opinions in a situation.
Yeah, that's fascinating, Ray. And so what I'm getting from that is it's perhaps less about the humility, if you like. It's more about the ability to ask good questions and generate that dialogue amongst the team.
Very much so. Very much so.
Oh, fantastic, thank you. Jessica, would you like to come in on that? Anything to add?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I have to agree with Ray. I'm not sure that the word humble really sort of resonates with me either. I think it's about creating that culture of empowerment. And I think Ray's used that word already. And I think to be able to do that, you have to achieve a level of self-assurance as a leader, so that you don't feel like you have to be the boss, or you don't have to have the answers all of the time. Sometimes people need you to, and maybe we can talk about that a bit later. But I think you have to have achieved that level of self-assurance to be able to empower other people to bring forward those ideas. So for me, I think it's about coaching people through the process of dealing with ambiguity. So in my organization, we are bizarrely, and I don't know how, we're a very diverse organization, but bizarrely in terms of age, about 60% of our staff are actually under the age of 25, which was a real sort of shock when I looked at the stats. And I think there's something that goes with that around maybe not having the level of life experience needed to deal with ambiguity. So certainly in my role, it's about helping them to find their own answers, and not just to get stuck on things and to naturally want to come back to me all of the time. And also helping them where, when they don't have the answers, they have a network of people they can go to. So quite recently we looked at the corporate risk register, and I was the biggest risk. And I was the biggest risk because I seemed to be the middleman in everything. Everybody would come to me, not necessarily for approval, but for advice or direction or whatever it may be. And so I think you really have to help your employees to sort of find a way through challenges, not just on their own, but to build those networks and those sort of support infrastructures around them. So yeah, that's my sort of take on it.
Yeah, that's absolutely fascinating, Jessica. So what I'm hearing there is the trust is really important, and almost the humility, if there is, it's about decentering yourself from the network, so that you actually, rather than everybody coming to you, the spider at the center of the web almost, you allow others to create their own network that spans across the business.
I think that's absolutely right. And there's a really interesting model on this. And I'm not sure if people in the audience or on the panel have seen this, but McKinsey came out with an organism structure. And it was really interesting because it was sort of like a cell-like organism. So rather than having this very hierarchical sort of, traditional organizational structure, you create sort of communities of practice, I suppose, that work with each other, that sort of bolster each other's competence, and they kind of work in that almost circular, flat, cellular way. And I think if you can create those relationships, and it's a little bit like we think of a social media platform, the network is everything. If you can create those relationships, then the organization is in a much stronger position to be able to evolve.
Yeah, absolutely. I saw the McKinsey article. It did remind me of a terrorist cell structure, to be perfectly honest, which is interesting. But we'll leave that for a moment, another debate. But thank you very much. That's fabulous, Jessica. Adam, anything? How would you How do you see this humble, this mix of dialogue and creating trust?
I think both of the previous panelists touched on it, but I think for me, the tough gig is always the balance between being good at what you do and knowing your stuff and being in possession of the facts to run the company well, which people want because they need to know their leader is well versed and prepared, versus do you actually come across as as the exact opposite of humble? And I think that is tough to pull off, but I think that you've got to find a balance between treating people with respect and being approachable and allowing them to come and ask questions and make suggestions, but also being in possession of the facts yourself and being able to let people know that you have that knowledge and you want to try and pass it on to them. I've been watching the news a lot, as we all have lately, and I think it's really interesting how the Ukrainian leader, Zelensky, is all over the news, and I've never seen anyone, I don't think, in my lifetime so far have so much praise for being such a good leader. And of course, we don't really know if he is or not, because we only see what's in the paper and on the TV. But he's on the front line, and he appears to be a guy who has people around him and does a lot of listening and a lot of engaging, and perhaps not a huge amount of telling and pointing. So I think we should take a lot from that, perhaps.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that sense of balance, Adam, is absolutely key. And it's interesting, we've had a couple of questions coming in about, does this being humble, does it work all the time? Does it work in all environments? And from my own experience, I can remember being on the top of a mountain in a blizzard with a group of junior soldiers. And probably the last thing they wanted to hear from me was, I didn't know what I was doing, and did they have any ideas? So I think there's definitely got to be striking that balance. So that's great. Thank you ever so much, Adam. Louise, last but not least, your reflections, please.
I think I'd just pick up on what, Adam's point around that balance. I've actually been criticised a couple of times in board meetings by senior investors, basically saying, why are you being so humble? why don't you shout more about, and celebrate more the great things that you're doing? And I think, that's to paint humble as a negative, which I think we often do. We think about humility as a negative output. And you mentioned, moments of adversity when being humble isn't a good idea. You need to step out of your comfort zone and actually say, right, I can lead here. And it is that balancing act between, if you fall into the trap of being too humble, I think you often forget those moments where you need to stop and say, actually, we did a really good job there. And I use we rather than I, because that's how I would approach it with my teams. But if you're constantly putting other people first, so I think being humble isn't thinking less of yourself, it's thinking about yourself less. So, sometimes if you go too far down that route, you forget to stop and actually, celebrate those moments when you have managed to get to the top of the mountain. You didn't look down, you kept looking up. And the problem is if you are, as Jessica mentioned, the kind of center, that connector, if you can't put that humility to one side, then other people learn to do that too. So then you aren't celebrating those often small wins, which could be pivotal to growing your business. So I would say humble isn't always a negative. I try to go on. I try to be humble with my teams, but at the same time, you can't use it all the time. So it's a balance, as Adam said.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's an important point you made there about using the language of we, not I, but then, of course, backing it up by almost, I suppose, allowing other people to role model the behaviours that you want to see more broadly. So, yes, fantastic. Thank you very much. So let's just carry on with this theme then, talking about being humble, all well and good. But in anxious times, people may not want to hear that you've no clue what to do next. So when do you lead with questions and when do you lead with answers? Even if you're uncertain that the answer is what, right? Could any of the panel give some examples when they've been in that situation? Should we try Jessica? You're nodding your head. I'm going to go to Jessica first of all, then, please.
I'm sure we all have, and I think that's probably the thing that's been picked out to the last sort of discussion point, really, is that leadership is situational. It has a time and a place, not just in terms of the style that you use. And many people will be familiar with Goleman's leadership styles. And, when do you need to be commanding, for example, in a situation of crisis? When do you need to be more democratic, more humble? All of these things have a time and a place. But for me, it's also about the leader having a time and a place. So I say that in the sense of, sometimes when we have a particular problem in our organization, I'm not the right person to lead that. And so again, it goes back to empowering the people who do have those capabilities to take that forward and to feel confident in doing that. So yeah, I could probably give you lots of different examples of that, but for me, it's about creating, sort of semi-structured environments as well for doing that. So we have two types of meeting in our organization that we sort of call on ad hoc. One is a problem-solving meeting, and we generally have it in a time of crisis, and it needs a leader. That doesn't necessarily mean it's me, but it needs somebody to drive the conversation towards a conclusion and to get those kind of actions and those steps forward. But that could be anybody who performs that role. And then we have these kind of ideation sessions. So maybe we're going to run a new marketing campaign, or we're going to design a new feature, and really they're kind of open forums to get as many people involved as possible and get as many different views. So, and they don't have a leader, they have a facilitator, but they don't have a leader. They're much more democratic. So yeah, I think it's situational. Everything has a time and a place.
Yeah, and it's interesting what you say, almost crafting that environment. So is there a sense that perhaps with a more inexperienced team, you would be there offering the answers, but you'd be thinking of the future of building an environment in which they would increasingly be able to offer the answers themselves, and you can step back into a more questioning role?
I think that's absolutely right. And that's the other dimension of it, isn't it? Is, what's right in terms of a leadership style today is not necessarily where you want to be in sort of 3, 6, 12 months time. So it is about, for me, if you think you've got one leadership style, whether that's humble or commanding or whatever it is, and you think that's okay, then that's where the problem is, right? Because you need to be able to evolve. And, the entire team, however large or small your organization is, whatever you do, you're all on a journey and you're all in it together. So, yeah, I think that's absolutely an approach that a small and a young organization would take.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that you're right. The power of the reflective leader is all important. Absolutely. And Adam, would you like to come in on this?
Well, I can. My answer really will partly answer question 3, I think. So
excellent.
Well, sort of a seamless link. I was going to say 3 things. One was that if you've ever tried to answer a question by committee, so you've got a whole bunch of people together who want to have input, and it almost becomes a committee answer where everyone puts their ideas forward, it becomes slow and torturous and clunky. And I'd really urge you all to steer away from that, because it is time consuming and it does ruffle some feathers because not everyone gets their own way. I think a leader will often have an end game in sight when they ask an open question, but no leader has the embargo on good ideas, and quite often we'll think of things in our workplace and we'll be pretty sure at the beginning that the answer is going to be X, and actually by the end of it it's X with a bit of Y and a bit of Z, and it's got a bit of colour to it, and we do that a lot, and we change ideas halfway along a process because someone's cropped up with something which we just wouldn't have thought of. And the final thing I was going to say in response to that question, which will make some people sweat a bit, is I do believe sometimes in letting people fall on their sword every now and then when there's no risk attached. I think sometimes if someone's got a really good idea and particularly if they're learning about leadership, let them try something if there's no risk attached, and let them learn from the experience of what could have happened if they'd done it differently.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right there. There's the distinct difference, isn't there, between letting somebody fail as opposed to allowing them to be a failure. And I think that's an important point to make. And of course, we tend to learn from our mistakes. So absolutely a good lesson for any leader. I also like the idea of sort of, again, it's less possibly about humility. It's almost about having the courage to relinquish leadership at times and having the confidence that that won't denigrate you in the view of your followers. Because I think there's sometimes a sort of heroic leadership model is that I've always got to have the answers. And if I don't, I'm no longer the leader forever. Whereas it's just relinquishing it in a short span. Would you agree with that? Is that what you were getting at, Adam?
Yes, I think so, James. And I also think it's important but difficult sometimes to allow your mind to be changed and then still be entirely positive about the decision that's been made. So if you were dead set on the outcome being A and it ends up being A.5, be behind it. And it's difficult, and I'm at fault for this myself sometimes. It's difficult to support something that you didn't really want to be the outcome.
Yeah,
but
absolutely.
you learn from it, and it shapes what you do in the future.
Yeah, particularly if you've had a great idea and you've thought of it for weeks and then nobody likes it.
Yes.
Yeah, been there. Great. Ray, would you like to come in with any comments on this?
Sure, yeah. Interesting about sort of saying about the questions and answers. I mean, I think I'm quite well known in my own small team for being captain conflict when it comes to having frank and open discussions about how things should be done. I think our frank and open discussions can sometimes echo around the building in terms of how we see things moving forward, or the direction things should go in, or how things should be done. But I actually really encourage that side of things. I believe that the ability to confidently and openly challenge a decision or a thought process is possibly one of the healthiest things you can do in that leadership environment, because I spent years being terrified of speaking my mind for fear of saying the wrong thing, or for fear of not being listened to. Throughout sort of my working career, I've had a lot of different roles. Most of them have been in technical industries. I've been surrounded by people who really knew what they were doing in a lot of cases, and I've been surrounded by a lot of people who quite honestly really didn't, but ended up where they were through all sorts of crazy decisions. And I think for me, the most important thing is to be able to confidently challenge and be able to express a difference of opinion in an environment where you know that's going to be taken seriously, and be able to explore all elements of that position. And I think that we certainly as a small team welcome those challenges from within our team. So if we're sat in a meeting, if we're talking about how something should go or what direction we might go in, that anything that comes from within that team is taken into that decision. And if somebody seems to have a better approach or a better idea, or something that would make more sense to try, then we're always open to trying that. You know what I mean? I think that's the more important part. I mean, it's different in a lot bigger organization. I can see that the constraints around that, having worked in much bigger organizations, that process becomes more difficult and more challenging. And channels are set up to try and feed back into the system in a different way. But when you are small and dynamic, you have much more flexibility about being able to take everybody's ideas into that melting pot and turn them into something good. And in terms of making a decision, I mean, I've always believed on the even a no decision is better than none at all. So, even if the case is, okay, we're going to sit on this for a while, because until we've got more information about what we're doing, or until we feel that we've got the right approach, let's just do nothing for now, sometimes is the best way of dealing with something, whilst not sort of doing the I don't know. Some people it feels more comfortable to do it that way. So I think we're a very diverse team in terms of ages, in terms of abilities, and I think that I think hand on heart, everybody's opinion counts in what we do. So I'm proud of the fact that there's no one person is overlooked in that decision, whether they're just getting started or whether they've been there for years.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's interesting what you say about, you started off being saying be careful about what you say, because it will have reverberations. Yeah. What you do, what you say. I can remember doing an inspection in a barrack block and just commenting on some flaking paint. I came back an hour later, the paint pots were out and everybody was, I didn't mean you to paint it. So I think that's really important. And in that sense also of the imposter syndrome, you sitting there and feeling as though you don't belong, and what could I possibly contribute? I mean, it's reassuring to know that actually the vast majority of us suffer from that. If you don't, you're probably a psychopath or a megalomaniac. So if you're feeling that out there, don't worry, we all get it. That's great. Thank you ever so much for that, Ray. Louise, what would you like to add with regard to this?
Just to probably pick out two things from the previous comments there. I think what Ray was saying about, you know, not necessarily looking for confrontation, but facing it head on when you need to. I think training yourself to have those very difficult conversations. It's almost like the old adage of the bills piling up on the mat. And if you leave those bills piling up and you don't open them, the problem becomes a much bigger problem than if you open the letter on the first day. And I've taken this approach through leading lots of different teams. And there's a moment where you think to yourself, I'm not going to make that phone call, or I'm not going to go into that meeting, or I'm not going to send that email. I'll just leave it till tomorrow. And actually by tomorrow, it's escalated into something much bigger. And then you've got to really deal with it, perhaps with conflict. So I really often in the past would have forced myself to have that difficult conversation. That's second nature to me now, because I've done it. It's just been practiced over the years. But I also encourage my senior leadership team to do the same thing. So a bit like Jessica, a lot of our team are under 30, under 25, and encouraging them to pick up the phone is very interesting, because they don't really like to do phone calls. But I do try to encourage them to do that with customers as well. It's not just about managing that within our own teams. It's thinking about how, if there's an issue or a challenge with a customer, picking up the phone or communicating early on with that challenge and having that difficult conversation really, really goes a long way to solving any problems you might be facing. And then also, just to go back to a point that Adam made around failure, one thing we do at Tramshed is we pride ourselves on creating spaces where people can fail. And we actually value failure. And we do this because we recognize that 9 out of 10 entrepreneurs will fail at some point in their journey. So we would be absolutely silly to not value failure. But it's quite an interesting viewpoint, because you know, a lot of times when we hear about entrepreneurs, we hear success stories and we hear wonderful times, and there haven't been any problems, and they've managed to make millions within a year. But we don't always hear, especially in the UK, about the failures. And we do a lot to encourage serial entrepreneurs, second, third generation entrepreneurs, to come back and speak to early stage startups about those times when they failed. And they can be heartbreaking stories. They can be really difficult to listen to, but learning from those failures is actually a greater experience often than learning from someone who's had it, really successful all the way through. So I think from me, the takeaways are: have that difficult conversation, have it early, and value failure within your organization, because people will get up and they'll go again if you don't make a big deal of them failing.
Yeah, no, it's great. I like that idea of sort of almost training or rehearsing for the difficult conversations. And I think that in part that ties in with the psychological safety, because you can almost nip the problems in the bud before they become a difficult conversation by airing them and allowing people, rather than letting it fester. So I think that's really important. And again, that idea of generational differences, that's getting quite a lot of airtime at the moment. Generational differences, whether the generations are different, how they're different, how they respond. So again, as a leader, worth reflecting on what perhaps those new the new employees, what differences are they bringing, and possibly having some interesting chats, perhaps some reverse mentoring with the youngsters. Yeah, absolutely. And yes, the courage to fail, absolutely, and the courage to ask a stupid question within boundaries. Great, thank you very much. Okay, so just moving on then. So we've been talking about the importance of psychological safety and the importance of, as a result, getting collective intelligence effectively. So we've got all the knowledge on the table in front of us. Could anybody give an example of when every voice has counted in their business or in their experience, and it was the only way through a challenging situation? Does anybody like to come forward with a possible example?
I'll just pick up on. I think that, you know, the one we all need to probably mention is COVID, and this was a time, probably the only time in my career, where I couldn't draw on examples that I'd had previously or experiences that our team had had previously. You know, every single day was bringing a new challenge. You know, who would have thought that we needed to invest in bits of plastic and stickers for the floor and signs to go everywhere telling people what to do, how we would look at hybrid working, all the different challenges that came up. And it was quite difficult because you didn't necessarily have something to compare that to, so you had to kind of go back to your core resilience. You know, I've been through really hard challenges in business, so how did I get through that, and knowing that actually if I failed at something or something went wrong, it wasn't terminal, it wasn't the end, there was a tomorrow. So drawing upon that. But what we did is, so we have a weekly SLT, we have a weekly senior leadership meeting. That is just an hour. It's always on a Monday. We have it at the same time every week. It's in a rhythm. And that's our opportunity to hear everyone's voices. And that's very much mapped to our key drivers and looking at not just financial performance, but how are we performing as a team, as a business, against our bigger, wider goals. So what we did during, right at the beginning of COVID, when, you know, our business is about bringing people together. We didn't even know how we were going to survive, you know, 2 years of what happened to be closures, which was very, very difficult. So what we did is we made a 9 a.m. meeting every morning, and that was a rhythm, a battle rhythm, if you like. And we did that every single morning. And that was an opportunity for every voice to count, because, you know, as a leader, as other senior leaders in the business, not one of us had all the answers. So we had to bring everybody together, and also to sense check decisions. You know, we were saying, well, you know, what is safe for our staff? What is safe for our customers? What is safe for our building? You know, what should we do here? And bringing those conversations, those questions to the wider group was really, really helpful. Because there were times when we had to say, we don't have the answer, but what are the options? Right? Okay, guys, what do we think? Where are we going to head with this? And I've got to say, I think that battle rhythm was really the thing that not just got us through day to day, but it gave everyone the confidence that we were going to get through the next day and the day after that, because everyone was really open and communicating about the challenges. And, you know, we don't need that now. We don't have that every single day in that same rhythm. But we were quite religious about that, and it really, really helped. It really got us through.
Yeah, it's really interesting that I think one thing COVID has done is make people more aware of meetings. So I think we've all probably sat through those sort of Monday morning meetings that are really just people sharing information. You're sitting there thinking, you could have sent me this on an email. Whereas what I think you're doing there is being far more deliberative about what the meeting is about. And everybody knows what the meeting is about, and they come prepared to contribute rather than just to listen, which I think in that sort of very fluid environment, certainly as we were going into COVID and hybrid working, that was absolutely key. Yeah, so that's brilliant. Thank you ever so much. And any other reflections? Let's just move on and just talk about a bit more about COVID then. Any other examples of how your approach to this changing work environment, and perhaps how allowing the teams to talk up has helped you? Yeah, Jessica.
Maybe not directly answering your question, but basically we started our business during COVID, and we did it, you know, I suppose to do things differently. So we came from corporate manufacturing environments where things were very, very hierarchical. We had lots of meetings for the sake of it, and people turned up to meetings and didn't know what to do, you know, back to some of those examples. And we really wanted to just re-engineer the way that we work. And for us, it was all about trust. And it was about, you know, if you're going to bring people into your business, then you should have a level of confidence and a level of trust, not just in their abilities, but also in the fact that they're going to deliver and that they're going to be committed and that, you know, you're going to want the same thing. So we really used COVID as a sort of catapult to set up a very, very different way of working. And it's been really interesting for us. I mean, we sort of set up about 2 years ago, and there were 4 of us until just under a year ago. Now there's 27 of us. So we've kind of seen this rapid growth in the last 12 months. And it's been really, really interesting bringing people into the business. So we brought a new chap in just yesterday. Well, he came in last week, but I met him for the first time yesterday. And I said, you know, how are you finding things? And he said, I'm really enjoying it, but I'm finding it really different. And I'm not quite sure. He said, I've been writing my hours down. I said, right, okay. He said, do I give you my hours? And I said, well, you can do, but I'm probably, you know, not really going to look at them. And he said, well, I don't really understand, because people are asking me, you know, how many hours do I work and when do I work? He said, I don't really know what to tell them. And it's really funny, isn't it? Because I think we've had it ingrained into us for so long that work means, and it does in, you know, in employment law, work means, you know, time spent for rate of pay at location. And actually, at least 2 of those things don't really matter anymore, certainly not in our company, because you can work when you like, you can work for as long as you like. It's about value creation rather than it is about, you know, actual sort of time spent sitting at a desk or whatever. And if you finish your work 3 hours early, then, you know, go and do something else. It's absolutely fine. So it's been quite an interesting shift for people coming into the business. And one of the things that we've tried to do is create opportunities, and I suppose embed opportunities in every area for people to contribute. So an example of that is, and it's really basic, right? But it's been quite a difficult thing for some people, including myself, to grasp in a way. So everything we do is in the cloud. So every document we create from within Google Drive, and everybody who should see it and can access it. And that's been really challenging, because some people think, oh, well, I upload my work when it's completed. And it's moving from, you know, completing pieces of work independently and having, you know, set kind of functions, to working in a way where we have cross-functional teams that are involved from day one in the progression of a piece of work, and they can dip into that Google Drive at any time and add some comments to it. And, you know, I totally appreciate Adam's point that sometimes you can end up with, you know, almost too much democracy, and sometimes you need to sort of draw people to a conclusion, or we keep, you know, iterating indefinitely. But it's worked really, really well. And I think the nicest thing about it is people feel like they're valuable. They feel like they're contributing something, and they get in that real-time feedback, and they're able to kind of course correct and explore new things on the fly. And that's worked really, really well for us. So sorry, it's not a direct answer to your question, but I suppose what I'm trying to say in a nutshell is we seem to think that people matter when we've got a crisis and we need them, but actually people matter all the time, and we have to find ways to embed these opportunities into our business for people to matter and to make a really valuable contribution.
Yeah, I think fascinating points. The one that really resonated with me immediately was people coming in during COVID, because I joined the university during COVID, and I had a real sensation of I didn't know what I didn't know. So I didn't even know what questions to ask. So there were problems around the environment and sort of things that were new, but they're also, it's again exposed, rather like meetings, things that have always been there bubbling beneath the surface. The idea of presenteeism you were talking about, that it's about bums on seats, and as long as you're there for 8 hours doing, well, whatever, it doesn't really matter, when we know with the appraisal process that it's actually about objectives. That's why we have set them. So as long as you're achieving your objectives, what's the problem? And what you're also doing, which I think is absolutely fabulous, is taking people beyond that. So you've achieved your objectives, but how does it affect the rest of the team? How does it connect together? And you're helping breaking down silos, I would imagine helping in employee engagement. So fascinating the way it's taken a crisis for us to sort of sit back and go, well, it should have always been like this, shouldn't it? Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. Ray, have you got anything you'd like to add?
think a lot of what I would say would probably echo some of the stuff that Louise mentioned and Jessica's mentioned, actually. We had a huge shift when we went into COVID lockdown. Obviously, everything moved to an online environment, same as you, Jessica. We moved to Teams. Everything was part of this different structure. But I think the less we saw of each other, the more we talked to each other. And we also had that daily call, checking in, okay, what are we going to do today? How are we going to tackle this today? What problems do we need to solve? And that rhythm definitely helped us through that difficult period. We were unfortunate enough to lose some of our colleagues in the first wave of the lockdown, and lost others later on due to redundancies and other things that happened, or people moving on. There's been quite a big churn recently in staff in our sort of little group of companies, and we've all had to learn how to do other things, and that we've all had to sort of rely on each other's understanding of a situation or a field of interest or subject, and we've had to work it out between us. And we've got a really good, strong team, and all of the people that are involved in that team have an equal part to play in the success of what we're doing. And we are very much for the greater good. It's that sort of all for one and one for all situation. It sounds like a cliche, but it's very true, and I think because we all want the same thing and we're all invested in the same thing and we all do it for each other, that it's a different sensation to it just being a company or just being a product or just being a service. It's a very different feeling. And I would say certainly we learned a lot of lessons going through COVID. As you say, it was, what was the crisis du jour? We literally every day it was something new that we had to kind of take on board, and people came to me and asked me, what should we do with this? What should we do with that? I don't know, we've not been here before, so let's work it out together. And it very much was that sort of sensation, but we got through it, and much stronger as a team as a result. We don't need the same level of interaction that we had then, like you say, Louise. We've sort of backed off from that daily kind of roll call, but we're now very much more in touch with what everybody's doing than we ever were previously. So it's all been a good thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, the lessons that are coming out are ones that we probably should have learned before COVID, but it took COVID to cement them.
It took a crisis to make it happen.
It did, didn't it? Yeah, I mean, we talk now about relationships, the importance of checking in, and you think, well, surely that's always been the role of a leader and a manager, to build those relationships, to check in with people. And also we've got that sense now of, we've seen what redundancy really looks like. We used to joke about what happens if somebody falls under a bus, and then suddenly we had the reality of COVID, and we've actually had to work out how to be multifunctional, how to do other people's jobs, and how to cope with redundancy in real time. So again, fabulous lessons. I say fabulous lessons, that sounds dreadful. Tragic lessons in a sense, but really important lessons for leaders and managers. Can I turn now just finally to Adam on this issue? What have been your experiences, Adam, please?
I'm still sweating, James, from you mentioning someone falling under a bus. That's something I don't want to
hear. My apologies. That must have been very close to the heart.
No, it's fine. Well, it depends on the team of people involved, isn't it? So if you're talking about engineers and drivers and frontline staff, we have to be at work. The big problem there was comms. How do you communicate with them? During COVID, they all had 10 times the number of questions they would normally have had. So we had to do some really swift, innovative thinking. We introduced Blink, we started doing video messaging for staff and all those sorts of things. And then for those who would normally be in an office and found themselves working at home, perhaps in a home that wasn't designed for home working, with nowhere special to sit and plenty of distractions from pets and family members and whatnot, how do you stay in touch with them? How do you keep their spirits up? And some didn't want to be working from home, but they had to be for safety. So there was no textbook on how to manage a team during COVID. It was, pick it up as you go along and try and not drop too many clangers, really. That's the swift answer to the COVID question. But in general terms, I think we're a different company now to what we were 2 years ago. We're much more collaborative. We do things differently in most respects now, and I think we've had good success in recruiting people who work where they want to work, really. If they want to do 5 days behind a desk here in Cardiff, they can. And if they want to do 2 days at home, that's also fine. It doesn't work for all roles, but it works for most office roles for us. And we found that quite useful. And we've retained, I think, people who would otherwise have left because of that.
Yeah. So one of the overall lessons then from our discussion would be, if you want to improve working relationships, create a crisis. That seems to be one of the answers. Great. So just to close then, can I ask just each of you briefly just to offer your last pearls of wisdom to the audience, please, around psychological safety? And can we start with Ray, please?
Sure, yeah. I think for me, it's very much encouraging discussion. It's making sure that everybody's opinion is valued, that they feel valued, that everybody feels like they have something worthy to contribute, that it's aired, even if it's contentious, that it's discussed and it's explored, and it contributes to the direction of where we're all going. And I think as long as people lead with, I'm going to say compassion, but that sounds awfully grand, but without ego, I think that is definitely what I would say. As long as it's for the greater good, even if you don't know the answers, even if not everybody has the vision, I think it's very important that it comes very much from the greater good of what we're trying to do here, rather than I as a person have to be leading what's happening. And I think as long as everybody can sort of, take stock, reflect, I think that will make everybody much more effective as leaders in the future.
Great. Thank you very much, Ray. Great. Jessica, please.
Yeah, of course. Well, first, I completely agree with Ray on that. I think that's a really important point. The bit that I would add to that, I suppose, 2 points. One is around trust. So, let's build trust in from the offset. Yes, COVID has been a lesson to a lot of us in how we can work differently, how we can be more accommodating, how we can get the best out of people. We must not lose sight of that. I think it's really, really easy to forget what we've learned from any kind of crisis, COVID being a prime example of that. And I'm seeing lots of companies who, are wanting to force their staff to go back into the workplace, and more often than not, it isn't necessary. So it's not losing sight of the fantastic lessons that we have learned from what was an awfully unfortunate situation, and remembering from that it is a two-way relationship. I think, unfortunately, when we think of an employment relationship, as employers, we almost think we're doing someone a favor by giving them a job and by paying them at the end of the month, but we need those people in our business. So it's remembering that it's a two-way relationship, and it is people at the end of the day, and we have to not treat people like numbers and treat them like individuals. And then the other just thing to add to that is around empowerment, which is a word that's come up a number of times in this discussion, and really about creating opportunities within the business and building those opportunities in for people to explore, to fail, as Louise put it, to develop and to grow.
Great, thank you very much. We'll come to Louise. Louise, I'm going to have to say very quickly, please.
That's good, because I've only got two very quick things. The first one is we talked a lot about situational awareness, and I think one thing we didn't really touch on, but we've mentioned a few things that kind of skirted around it, is the function of emotional intelligence. And I think Jessica did mention, the right leadership for the right moment. It's the right leadership, the right moment for the right group of people. So having that emotional awareness and thinking of yourself, but also thinking of the wider group is key to that. And then the last thing is, don't be embarrassed by failure. Learn from mistakes, go again.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Finally, Adam.
Mine's even quicker. I believe in plain talking, so mine's nice and simple. And it's this: do a 360 feedback session on everyone who works for you. I've done it 3 times now. It's terrifying. You get some really stark feedback. It has to be anonymous. But we've made some of the best changes here based on feedback from frontline staff we'd never have thought of. So do a 360 feedback and find out what people really think of the leadership team's approach.
Absolutely. As a former 360 feedback coach, I couldn't agree more. Brilliant. Right, just finally to wrap us up, thank you to Ray, Jessica, Adam and Louise. And should you wish to develop your leadership, we have an offer as part of the Help to Grow scheme, which is offered by universities and business schools across the country, a government scheme. We're offering a free funded place should you wish to. So do get in touch with Chambers Wales if you're interested in entering a free draw for a place for people on your business. Okay, so thank you again to the panel. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. All the very best. Have a great day.
Thanks, James.
Thanks, Louis.